permit. Okay, let's begin. What we'll try to do is wrap up Article 101 today, finishing off vertical restraints and talking about the horizontal block exemptions. As we saw last time, one of the problems, the competition problems, which is a particular concern in the EU regarding the use of vertical restraints, is the potential for such agreements to divide or partition the market, contrary to the goals of the EU or the EEC common market ever since its foundation. And we saw this in the Constant and Grundig case, where vertical restraint was being used by Constant and Grundig in an attempt to, in effect, re-implement national borders as barriers to trade. And this is again seen in the GlaxoSmithKline case more recently, which is a pharmaceutical case in which the drug manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline, in an attempt to prevent parallel trade, that is the importation or the exportation and re-importation of goods, attempted to impose a dual price system. In other words, one price for the domestic market, another price for the export market. This was held to be a restriction, problematic, and indeed a restriction by object. So the most severe type of restriction. So any agreement that limits parallel trade is viewed as a restriction by object, which means we then go back to the object effects analysis.
Yes, the parallel trade is external or internal?
It's internal to the EU. So for instance, the goods would be available in the Spanish market at one price, and then sold to the, let's say, a Scandinavian market at a different price, but all of it. The effects abroad, in other words, outside of the EU, is less of a concern. Okay, and that tends to be a common proposition with all competition regimes. Americans don't care about cartels abroad. They only care about cartels affecting the American market, similar with the EU. Okay? So, in other words, any agreement that limits parallel trade or any agreement that reimposes national boundaries according to the Court of Justice, so this is authoritative EU law, is a restriction by object, and therefore is almost impossible to justify. We're calling that object effects restriction. So in most cases where you have a large market share, vertical agreements will be analyzed by the object effect distinction that we talked about earlier, right? Okay, and in particular, resale price maintenance is used, is very much viewed as a restriction by object. Now, if the market share is low, okay, and we'll get to that, there is an exemption provided by Regulation 330. You should have a look at that regulation. It's very short, okay? And also this is discussed in the guidelines, paragraph 48. So if the market share is fairly low, and provided that certain clauses that aren't found in the agreement, and the agreement does not have as its object certain practices, that agreement is exempt from the from analysis. So Regulation 330 is key. You'll see, and we'll get to it, the exemption applies only if there's a smallish market share for all parties involved, and the turnover, the amount of commerce involved is quite low, 50 million euros. Okay, 50 million euros sounds like a lot, but in the context of the EU trade, it isn't. So if this threshold is met, and if certain restrictions aren't found in the agreement, then the agreement is exempt from competition law scrutiny. Okay? Please look at Regulation 330. We'll talk about that a bit more. Now, other examples that we saw, the Alliance Hungaria case. We talked briefly about the Alliance, or mentioned the Alliance Hungaria case in the context of the object and effects distinction. The Alliance Hungaria case is sort of interesting. In Hungary, automobile repair shops and insurance brokers are basically one and the same. The company, the firm that fixes your car, if you get into an accident, is also the firm that sells you insurance. Okay, and they're the insurance broker. Okay, so they'll go and now Alliance Hungaria, very large automobile insurance provider in Hungary, had an agreement with these brokers slash automotive repair shops, okay, body shops, okay. The agreement was the more of our insurance you sold, the higher your hourly rate we would pay. We would pay a higher hourly rate for repairs. So for instance, if you sold insurance at a lowish level, you'd receive a low hourly rate for automobile repairs. If the amount of insurance you sold was higher, you'd receive a higher rate. You see the problem with that? What's the problem with that?
It's a vertical contract.
Well, it's a vertical contract, but that in itself is not necessarily a problem. Okay. So the more Alliance Hungaria policies you sell at one side, the higher you're paid at the other side of your business, right? So does that provide an incentive to sell anybody else's insurance policies? No, it doesn't, right? The more Alliance, particularly when you're near a threshold, right? The more Alliance Hungaria policies you sell, the higher your rate for repairs are, right? You sell more, you get more. Not just of insurance policies, but you get more for your repairs. So what it does is it makes it more difficult for other insurance companies to compete for that business, right? When you're near that threshold, the salesperson's incentive is to sell Alliance Hungaria and not tell you about anything else. You see that? Okay. Now, that's what knows a foreclosure effect. It forecloses the market. It prevents other insurance companies from entering into the market. Okay, and the repair shops would be deterred from offering policies underwritten. And because of this, these vertical agreements that Alliance Hungaria had with these insurance brokers who are also automobile repair shops, these were held to be restraints by object. Okay, because of the foreclosure. Other restraints by effect, Delimitis versus Hennigenbrau. Remember that one? Does anybody remember Delimitis? Pardon?
Wide use of the contract.
The wide use of the contract, right. It was the pub. Okay, it tied beer supplies, and because of the tying, these contracts and their wide use had an effect of preventing it. Okay, it's the network of contracts which sealed off the market. Now, so, the analysis of verticals, okay, unless it falls within the block exemption, always reduces to object and effect analysis. Okay? One key and very interesting point is and this we see time and time again in cases that come before the court, and this is exclusive and selective distribution. Okay, this in particular, we see this with luxury goods. Okay, selective distribution in luxury goods, and we've seen exclusive distribution as a means of introducing a product to the market. Okay, let's start with exclusive distribution because we're familiar with this. Okay, remember the Société Technique Minière Maschinenbau case, the same with the Folk and Vervaeke case, where a company is trying to break into the market. And we said, given the low market share, the need for investment into a new market to advertise and promote the product, there are strong objective reasons, okay, to allow for some form of exclusive distribution. And the the EU law recognizes that exclusive distribution, in the absence of absolute territorial protection, does not automatically infringe 101. It depends upon the commercial circumstances surrounding the market. If there's a need to introduce the goods into the market, then that seems to be a very compelling reason to allow for it. So exclusive distribution in the absence of absolute territorial protection is a perfectly permissible way of introducing new products to the market. Okay. Selective distribution is slightly different. Selective distribution is typically used in cases where the goods are luxury items or are somehow complex. Okay? In other words, need active pre- and post-sale service, explaining how the goods work and perhaps troubleshooting after they're purchased. Okay? So high-end handbags and mobile phones, for instance. And in the case of luxury goods, part of what the luxury good manufacturer is trying to do is trying to convey a particular image, right, by its goods. Right? People buy these goods not just because of the quality of the goods, but because the image, possession, or using the good conveys. Right? You can get a perfectly adequate handbag at Marks and Spencer's for far less than a Mulberry or other sorts of handbags, right? Okay, but the image that a Marks and Spencer handbag conveys versus a high-end Hermes or whatever handbag conveys is completely different. Correct? Okay, and the manufacturer knows that and wants to preserve that. So how do they preserve that image? You all have experience seeing it. I don't know if you own these kind of handbags, but you see how is it presented? Preserved, protected.
Propaganda is investment.
Propaganda? We usually call that advertising. But you're right, it is a form of propaganda, okay? To convince you. So advertising, but advertising of a certain type and lifestyle, right? It's sold in certain locations, right? It's what I was saying yesterday, the difference between Bond Street and turning the corner into Primark on Oxford Street, right? Certain locations, certain stores, certain staff, perhaps if it's a complex good, certain training. If it's a complicated good, pre- and post-sale service, okay? Sales promotion, advertising, often trying to, I wouldn't say fix the prices, but ensure that sales of the goods are conducted only during certain periods. Okay, and that everybody else essentially tries to sell the goods at roughly the same price. Because nothing is more annoying to a high-end say a purchaser of a high-end good. Nothing's more annoying than the wrong person carrying that good, and that wrong person getting the good at 70% off. You know, imagine if you spent £1,000, or your husband spent £1,000 on a handbag for you for Christmas. You go down to London, and the person sitting next to you in the train says, "Oh, look, I've got one too. I got mine for £300." Right? Now, that would be sort of infuriating. Okay, so that's a concern, and these concerns are exacerbated by non-authorized retailers. So a lot of these luxury goods, you really want to keep being sold in the right stores by the right people in the right location of town. Okay, the original one was the Metro Grossmarkt case, and said that selective distribution is a perfectly legitimate business strategy. Okay? And it's a business strategy that's legitimate, but there are some conditions which limit its, how should we say, use. The resellers, so the retailers, have to be chosen on qualitative criteria, the quality of their store. Okay, you can't have a quota for the number of stores, not a quantitative restriction, but a qualitative restriction relating to the technical qualifications of the reseller and staff and the suitability of trading premises. So qualitative, not quantitative. You can't say, for instance, there will only be 15 retailers of my handbags in the UK. You can say there will be a number of retailers of my handbags, and those wishing to retail my handbags have to meet the following criteria. And these criteria must be on the basis of the quality of their store, not as a disguised restriction on the number of stores. So lay down uniformity of all potential resellers and are not applied in a discriminatory fashion. In theory, anybody who meets the criteria should be able to sell the product. Okay? In the guideline, the Commission expands on its interpretation and provides the and says that the qualitative nature is training the sales personnel, certain or certain range of products, but it's not a direct limit on the number of dealers. You also cannot disguise quantitative criteria by requiring, for instance, minimum or maximum sales, or fixing the number of dealers. Yes?
Yes, is that kind of behavior is anti-competitive? Because I think almost all luxury brands want to sell the luxury goods in Selfridge rather than Tesco.
Right, exactly. Because of the quality of Selfridge.
Yeah.
Okay, not the quality of Tesco.
Yeah.
Okay? So you may want to say, for instance, that I don't know exactly how, because these contracts are copyrighted and they're confidential. The criteria, the contractual terms are not really in the public domain. Okay, but you can, there are restrictions as to the sorts of stores. Tesco obviously falls afoul of them. Also, Tesco may make a commercial decision. Tesco in each of its stores, as big as they are, only has a finite amount of floor space. And, you know, can they make more profit turning over one Fendi bag a year on that piece of floor space, or can they, you know, make money turning over cider? Okay, so they may make a commercial decision that their clientele are not interested in those. Okay, now the other thing is you mentioned is Selfridges. Okay, and for those of you who are familiar with Newcastle upon Tyne, Phoenix is a high-end store up there. Now, one thing about these stores is quite often the departments are really franchises. Okay? So that Selfridge sets up a Fendi franchise, so gets an opportunity to run a franchise. And with the franchise clause, the Fendi can do a bit more, has a bit greater control over what it does. Cath Kidston, in a lot of their stores, sets a franchise. Okay, and you know, a franchisor can really determine who the franchisees is going to be in a clearer, more specific way than, let's say, a general wholesale agreement. Okay, so so these high-end stores, there are franchises in Harrods, for instance. If you go to Harrods, some of the areas are franchises, and the other thing is that Harrods and Selfridges are more likely to be willing to be appointed as an agent. And once you have an agency agreement, you can do a lot more things, right? Okay.
I'm sorry. What if that they make the quality criteria really strict?
Yeah, that's fine, so long as it's not a disguised quantitative criteria.
Would it be a kind of way to restrict the quantity? Quantity.
Well, ultimately, yeah, it would have that effect. The stricter it is, the fewer people that can meet it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but you don't set it as, you know, only 2.
Okay.
Okay, you said that anybody that meets these criteria can.
Yeah, but what if that, in practice, there are only 2 stores can meet the criteria?
That would be fine, as long as okay. Okay. Steps in ability to trade are laid down uniformly, as long as anybody has the potential of meeting it. Okay? And you may want to do that. Okay?
Even though that those criteria is really strict in an unreasonable way, like this.
Well, once you start getting unreasonable, then it may be disguised. Okay, but if you know, if you're really worried about, okay, you need the right location of town, right? That's automatically going to narrow things down.
Yeah,
Okay, you want a staff trained of a certain where your qualitative criteria. You may not want tackier or cheaper goods in your store, so that's going to necessarily lay things down. But if objectively you can justify these as, how should we say, promoting or underlying your brand and your brand's need, then it's fine. And it becomes a commercial decision because obviously the fewer opportunities people have to buy the product, right?
Is that preventing other retailers from entering this area?
Well, does it prevent? Well, no. In theory, it doesn't prevent people because anybody that meets the criteria should be able to get it. But if it's difficult, then it's really hard to get it. So
Potential prevention.
yeah, there's potential for that. Okay. So the guidelines, qualitative. Okay. So And then the guidelines set out in paragraph 175 and what follows, what's necessary. The nature of the product must necessitate a selective distribution system. That's been interpreted quite broadly. Really, the manufacturers get to determine whether it is a luxury good that they want a certain image or not. Okay? So, the nature of the product. Secondly, retailers must be on basis of objective criteria, going back to what we were talking about a few seconds ago. Okay, and third, it must not go beyond what's necessary. Maybe this gets into what's unreasonable. But if it's necessary, then it's acceptable. Typically, these deal with complex and luxury goods. As we said, there's a list of such items in Jones and Suffren and Dunn. So high-end handbags, yes. You know those Swarovski crystals? You know those little crystal ornaments that you see? They tried to use a selective distribution system, and they were told no. Those are really tacky. My parents are spending my inheritance on those things, so. And then it's hard to persuade, basically what the textbook writers say, and I think it's quite accurate, is that if you use a selective distribution system in one jurisdiction, it should be used in all jurisdictions. Okay, because it's pretty hard to say that Switzerland doesn't merit a selective distribution system, but and I use Switzerland because it is related to the EEU, but Paris requires a selective distribution system. Okay. Must be applied in a uniform, non-discriminatory manner. So you can't disguise it as a quantitative selection. Sometimes requiring that a wide range of products be stocked can be viewed as unnecessary restrictions. That it's stocked in specific types of stores. Depends how specific it is. If you say it's in large department stores, how many large department stores are there in the UK? Or large department stores with more than six floors? If you require a specific amount of stock, if you require a store to stock the entire range of the product, so usually it's a reasonable range or a wide variety of the range is required, or if you require the store to have a minimum sales of the product. That is a quantitative restriction. Why is that? Because you're only going to sell X amount, right? And if you require a given store to sell at least 1/10 of X, then at most you can have 10 stores. You see? Okay, so minimum turnovers. Our criteria must go beyond what's necessary. The Vichy case is kind of cool. Vichy was trying to give some kind of impression that they were almost a sort of a dermatological medicine, and required that a dispensing chemist be present when the goods be sold. Now, that was in the late 80s, that case. The other aspect of the Vichy case, was what would be happening if you required a pharmacist or a dispensing chemist to be present when the goods are sold. And the good's not really a medicine. What are you really trying to do? The good had to be sold in the presence of a pharmacist, dispensing chemist. What does that preclude? What manner of distribution does that prevent? What manner of sales? Sales over the internet. If a pharmacist had to be present, you couldn't sell it over the internet. So Vichy was attempting to use this, among other things, to get rid of internet sales. Givenchy, that was a high-end perfume. Some criteria were there. You can compare that with Pierre Fabre. Again, high-end cosmetics. Criteria are not acceptable. Okay, the goals must be legitimate and proportionately defined. Now, the Coty case, selective distribution applied to e-commerce, internet commerce. And a couple of cases there. Okay. The Coty case really consolidates what a lot of Pierre Fabre says. And it says that luxury goods may require a selective distribution system. And the element is that the selective distribution system somehow reflects the image of the goods, okay, and contributes to sustaining an aura of luxury around them. The criteria need to be, the same Pierre Fabre cases. And the issue here in Coty was the distribution of Coty perfumes, okay, using third-party platforms, which is, third-party platforms is whom? Who's a third-party platform for sales? Yeah, on the internet, yeah, but which platform on the internet? Amazon, exactly. So this is trying to restrict a distributor from going into the Amazon marketplace and selling Coty perfumes, right? Okay, and so Coty's online distribution says, you can sell our perfumes, but you can't sell them as a Amazon merchant. If you want to sell our perfumes, you have to have your own web page that reflects the brand image. Okay? The court held that that sort of restriction was perfectly fine. And if you wanted to sell online, it had to be done. If you wanted to sell online, a selective distribution system can require you to do so in a manner which was appropriate to the image that the goods, that the manufactured goods wanted to be portrayed. Okay, so luxury image is part of the goods allure, and hence, and it's up to the court to determine whether this has been done or can be done in the case. Now, arguably, you can say that Coty. I mean, my complaint about this is that this allows the current EU system really allows far too much leeway for a manufacturer to describe itself as a luxury or an image-conscious brand. For instance, you look at Coty goods, and you see them being distributed in the Shoppers Drug Mart, not the Shoppers Drug Mart, the Super Drug down at by Lidl. Okay. Now, is that sort of the image luxury conscious thing that one would want to preclude Amazon Marketplace distribution? You see what I'm saying?
They try to
maintain an image, and by maintaining an image, they're keeping it off Amazon, but yet it's being distributed at Superdrug down the street as we speak. That seems to be a bit, there's a bit of a tension there.
So this kind of message prevents the first-party platforms too.
This exactly. If you want to sell Coty products on the internet, you have to do it through your own platform. And your platform has to reflect the image that Coty wants to project. You can't sell it on an Amazon marketplace. Okay? Now, is the image that Coty wishes to reflect by preventing third-party platform distribution of their products, is that consistent with the image of their goods being sold in Superdrug down the street? I don't know. I'm not the luxury brand police, but to me that seems a bit inconsistent. Okay. Prohibition of third-party sites. The reason for it basically preserves the image, checks the quality of the sales site. Franchising is another important means of distributing goods. The leading case is the Pro Nuptia case. That is useful, and if you look at the Pro Nuptia case, you'll see a list of acceptable clauses, which do not run foul. Typically, they're promotion of the brand, perhaps a reflection of the commonality of interiors, certainly product quality control. What is the advantage of going and eating at McDonald's? Okay, there's very few advantages, but what's the main advantage?
Cheap.
Well, it's cheap, but also consistency. Wherever you go, it's the same food, it's going to taste the same, and you know it's going to taste the same. So you know, going in, you know what you're going to get, right? You know, whether you're eating McDonald's in Seattle, Singapore, Seoul, what have you, okay? It's going to be the same food. And the reason for that is that McDonald's insists on certain quality control, there's certain processes that ensures that. Okay? So, and because of the benefits, those sorts of clauses are very much permitted in franchising agreements. Intellectual property, the recipe for the secret sauce, the recipe for how to make a Big Mac or whatever. That form of intellectual property and certain, keeping that confidential is of course necessary. That goes in. Certain requirements about interior, the look of the interior, the look of the exterior, displaying signs, that's necessary. Other requirements, is McDonald's going to be terribly happy if you own a Burger King? Or if you open a Burger King in the McDonald's? If you open a Subway in the McDonald's? No, McDonald's is not going to be happy, okay? So those sorts of restrictions on competition are perfectly legitimate. But if you look at the various clauses, one aspect that's not in the clause is territorial division. What's your worst fear if you open a franchise? Is that they'll sell a franchise across the street from you, right? So you're going to want to insist on a territorial non-compete. In other words, if I open the restaurant or the franchise, there'll be no other franchise within a X radius of where I am, right? That's a form of territorial protection. That doesn't appear in the court's list, but all franchise agreements will have them. Okay? You'd be foolish not to have them, and they're likely, almost certainly, justified under 101(3), but nobody's challenged it yet. Right? Because you're not going to go into business, there's an ancillary restraint, or is a 101(3), or is a 101(3) justified clause, because you're not going to go into business. You're not going to go into business. You're not going to sign the franchise agreement unless there's a a territorial clause of that nature. Okay? Now, suppose you do see franchises of the same operation very close to each other. Remember, 15 years ago, I was in Seattle. Two main streets in Seattle. Seattle's the home of Starbucks Coffee, as you know. Two main streets in Seattle are Pike and Pine Streets. And on 3 corners of that intersection, there were Starbucks. Okay? So saying, I'll meet you at the Starbucks at Pike and Pine is not a good wave, but there are 3 Starbucks
Next to each other.
right across the street from each other. Okay, what does that tell you? Why would that happen?
I'm the king of the streets.
Pardon?
I'm the king of
You're
the streets.
the streets, yeah. They're all owned by the same company. Either they're all owned by the same franchisee or they're all owned by Starbucks, right? Nobody's going to want to split that market. So it's all owned by the same person. Whether that person's Starbucks itself or whether it's, and Starbucks number 1 is in the Pike Street Market. And there used to be a really big group of jazz buskers on the front. Anyway, if you ever get to see it, see Starbucks number 1. Okay. So that is aside, okay. Oof, okay, obviously we're not going to get to the block exemptions and horizontals. I'll spend 10 minutes of that next time. I want to talk about resale price maintenance and finish off today's lecture. Okay? Yes.
But it's quite normal to do this tutorial
Restriction, yeah.
maintain the turnovers.
Yeah, well, the territory, basically, if I make an investment in a McDonald's franchise, and the investment can be huge, I think it's in the millions, okay?
Yeah, because it's not.
I don't want my investment undermined by somebody making a similar investment across the street. Right? So it'll be treated as an ancillary agreement, or it'll be treated as a 1013 exemption. Because franchising is not going to work without that, right? I don't want to, I open a Subway, I don't want a Subway across the street from me, or next door to me. Okay? I have no control when McDonald's opens across the street from me, but I just have to assume that if it does, a number of people hate McDonald's sufficiently to still come to my restaurant. Resale price maintenance. Okay? Minimum RPM, maximum RPM, and what's problematic with each. Minimum RPM is a minimum price that the good can be sold on as. We all know what the problem of that is. It's a form of price fixing, yet it can have some advantages. It can provide, as we will see, a sufficient margin so that stores that require, or goods that require pre and post-sale service, so that those services can be provided. Maximum RPM, the good cannot be sold at more than a certain price. What's problematic with that? Sounds like a good thing, right? But what's problematic? Everybody sells it at that price, and it typically softens downward price competition. Right? You go into a corner store, a bag of sweets says, 95, not to be sold for 95, more than 95p on it. Everybody sells it at 95p. Nobody sells it at 79p. Right? So it softens price competition. Okay. In the event customers have gotten a better deal, it's a focal point. Okay, supplier coercion. If you allow for maximum RPM, because it's a focal point, what you can do is the retailers can ask the supplier to impose a maximum price on it and say, and then that is where all retailers sell it, so it basically reinforces our price fixing cartel. Okay. Commission frowns on it. Okay, and looks at the verticals. We won't talk about double marginalization. Okay, minimum RPM. Okay, it solves the free rider problem allegedly. Okay, and for the last 60 years, this has been one of the main arguments that has been used to support minimum RPM. And we see this free rider problem. You see these in the slides. These are actual ads that appeared in the UK in 2009 for a few weeks before a few department stores went nuts. Step into Middle England's best loved department store, stroll through the haberdashery, the auto department, where an awfully well brought up young man will bend over backwards to find the right TV for you, then go to Dixon's and buy it. Okay? Does anybody recognize what department store they're referring to? That's John Lewis. Okay. But the type is used in the John Lewis ads. Okay? And then there's another one there. Get off at Knightsbridge, visit the discerning shopper's fave department store, ascend the exotic staircase and let peers in the pinstripe suit demonstrate the magic of the latest high definition fashion, then go to Dixon's and buy it. What store are they talking about there? Knightsbridge. Harrods. Okay, so both Harrods and John Lewis went nuts when Dixon's put this on. Okay, they said, look, what these ads are doing is they're encouraging people to go to these stores, get the pre-sale service from John Lewis or Harrods, and then go somewhere else to a no-frills store, Dixon's Carphoneware, Dixon's, and then buy the good there. Now, if you had a minimum RPM, Dixon's couldn't do that, right? Okay. So it's basically free riding, the shopping experience, nice stores, pleasant sales staff, luxury goods, certification problem. You know, if you pay £1,000 for a handbag, you somehow it's certified that that's a luxury good. Okay. RPM can help entry into a new market, but entry into a new market can be done otherwise. Now, one can argue that RPM the use of RPM affects only a certain set of customers. Okay? The free riding problem is solved by whom? Or the free riding problem, not solved by whom, is a concern to whom? The free riding problem is a concern. You know, let's suppose you're debating whether to buy a Windows-based computer or an Apple computer, right? Now, there are really three sets of customers. Okay, when you talk about Apple customers, there's the Apple customers that will buy the latest Apple MacBook or whatever, right? Period, full stop, committed customers. Won't even think, okay, elsewhere, and they'll buy it irrespective of the service or pre-sale or post-sale. Then there's the non-consumers. They're not going to buy an Apple, wouldn't touch an Apple. They're the Windows people, okay? So neither the committed consumers nor the non-consumers are influenced by pre and post-sale service. It's only the marginal consumers. I'm thinking about buying an Apple, and then you go to the Apple store and you get the nice pre-sale service. Okay. The problem is that, okay, hang on, let's back up. The committed customers, okay, who are buying the product are in effect, with RPM, subsidizing the marginal customers. You see that? They buy it, they don't use the service. The marginal customers are on the fence, thinking about it. They go in and use the service. They may buy, they likely buy, they get the service. But part of who's paying for this, is the committed customers. Okay? So, in effect, the efficiencies do not necessarily flow to those who pay for the services. Okay? So you can look at that as a problem. with free riding and RPM. US, we'll look at it in the future when we talk about the legging case near the end of term. Now getting back to the irony of the pre and post sale service, remember that Harrods ad or that fake Harrods ad? Dixon's a few years later, okay, went into an alliance with Harrods to run their audiovisual department. Okay, runs the consumer electronics, and then now is the provider. So it's a nice irony that closes that way. Okay. This brings it to the end of today's time. I'm going to spend at most 15 minutes on the block exemptions. I'm going to try for 10, okay? Look at these slides, okay? The next set of slides on block exemptions. What you need to know is, first of all, the provisions of Regulation 330/2010. Have a look at those. Okay, that regulation's up for renewal and rewriting this year. Then you will need to look at essentially, why don't you look at the research and development block exemption and to see how those block exemptions are set out. Now look, for exam purposes, obviously any fact pattern will not fall into a block exemption, because as I said last time, that would end the analysis in your question. But you'll have to say it doesn't fall into it and then give a reason. Basically, the market shares will be too high, okay? Or it will contain a clause that's impermissible, okay? In real life, there are block exemptions. You'll have to have a look at them and know how they're applied, okay? But unfortunately, this course should be a full year, okay, to comprehensive. Okay? So I'll see you next week. I'll see you on Monday. Have a good, hopefully less rainy for me.